Welcome back, Night Owls. This is Dr. Nighttime. And tonight, this is going to be a little different. This is likely going to be the single most disturbing video I will ever upload to this channel. In the aftermath of the murder of Charlie Kirk, I find it appropriate to upload a video showing my insights and my perspectives. At first glance, this doesn't seem too disturbing. And from the mathematics perspective, there's nothing too disturbing there. If you've been following my videos, you'll know that I've uploaded one video discussing the problems of political extremism and the mathematical refutation of that political extremism, indicating that yes, there are some political opinions that do cross the line and are downright evil. And an implication that I guess I did not specify in that video is that no, it's not okay to just sit back and let that happen. Now, as bears repeating from recent events, it's also not okay to assign a death sentence to people who have not actually been committing or directly planning to commit murderous crimes. But part of this video will be discussing where the line should be drawn, rehashing the mathematics behind it. Where the most disturbing part comes in is that any of you who happen to be on my Facebook friends list will have had access not only to my mathematical posts, but to some of my political posts. Some of the stuff that I've posted there in the dripping red blood font, and I'll show you some examples if you don't know what I'm talking about, none of that was meant to be taken exactly literally, but if any of you detected that I may have politically motivated homicidal ideation, not homicidal intent, but ideation, you are correct. And those of you who didn't detect it, this is a bit of a warning, not a threat to you, but a warning that no, you can't always detect it, and to recognize the signs were definitely there. And part of it is, if you see those signs in stuff other people are saying or posting, take those signs seriously. Now, no, I am not going to commit a violent crime myself. I do have some safeguards in there. So while I can't give you a true insider's perspective on political violence and what it would take to stop it, I can get you close, what I would call a near insider's perspective. Throughout this video, I'm going to go through some of my darker thoughts, some of what people have said that have prompted me to fantasize about killing them, some of the gruesome ways that I fantasized about it, so that you know that I'm not just talking about randomly wishing that somebody would disappear. I specifically thought about the kind of suffering that I would want to put people through on their way out in their final moments. Then I'll be going through a rehash on the hour-long presentation I made nearly 2 years ago on when political extremism crosses the line and where the lines are. And then discuss when you identify that somebody may be supporting politically motivated murder, how to proceed and how not to proceed regarding talking that person down. So, as an intro, in the past, what sorts of incidents have pushed me to homicidal ideation? Note, ideation, not intent. Specifically, the sort of political speech that has prompted me to fantasize about killing people has pertained to the Israel-Palestine conflict. And the incident that I'm about to go into occurred in January of 2023. This was before the Israel-Gaza war began, when I was a regular member of and regularly posting to the Asexuality, Visibility, and Education Networks forum. Some of you may have noticed my tie, and yes, this is a tie of solidarity. It should be noted, on that forum, you can post about just about anything. There are very few topics that are forbidden to be discussed. After the start of the war, the Israel-Palestine conflict was added to that list. But this was before then, when I said, here is an important article talking about when Americans will turn a blind eye to anti-Semitism. If you are willing to give a free pass to anti-Semites who share your partisan views or help promote your partisan narrative, You're not our ally, you're an accessory to our suffering and sometimes to our murder. Now, I'm not posting the full article here. If you'd like to look it up, the article was posted on Real Clear Politics. While they generally pull stuff from other news sources, this was a Real Clear Politics original piece. Its title was Whitewashing Anti-Semitism, A Hatred of Many Colors, and was discussing the differences in responses to anti-Semitism at the hands of white people versus anti-Semitism at the hands of black people. This was in the aftermath of a small flurry of incidents, largely in Brooklyn, where black people were attacking Jews and vandalizing Jewish stores. To give you an example of an excerpt from the article in question, the anti-Semitism monitor Israel Biton uses a new term to frame what is happening. When anti-Jewish attacks are due to white supremacy, you get a clear condemnation. When it's committed by others, it's inconvenient anti-Semitism because it becomes difficult for some to understand that members of groups that are also victimized by hate crimes are no less capable of committing hate crimes. For posting this, my AVEN account was suspended for a period of 2 weeks. The official response from AVEN's moderating team was ironically playing directly into the issue of convenient versus inconvenient anti-Semitism that was highlighted in the article. Their full response was, "We understand that you're concerned about anti-Semitism. However, targeting non-white people won't uplift your own, and linking to racist articles trying to shift the focus of a debate of oppression against another oppressed group is against the terms of service. In the future, please be careful to consider the actual source of oppression instead of siding with the oppressors against minorities. Thereby, you only slash against another group, which anti-Judaists will take as an excuse to oppress more people." And by the way, a year and a half prior to this, a similar case had come up back when I was actually on the moderating team, where a user was supporting Hamas's violent resistance, and the moderating team took no issue with that. So there's a clear double standard present. So apparently, it's pretty clear they think that anti-Semitism only counts when it comes in the form of white supremacism. Exactly the issue I was talking about. Exactly the being accessory to our suffering and sometimes to our murder that I was talking about. And they pretty much came back and said, guilty as charged, but we hold the power. You're suspended for 2 weeks. Apparently, they think they can tell me what the actual source of oppression is. That somehow, when a black person punches a Jewish person in the streets, somehow you blame white people for that, and that's the only person you're allowed to blame. Apparently, when I'm siding with the people getting punched, saying that whoever punched them should be condemned, apparently the people getting punched were the oppressors, because I'm somehow siding with the oppressor. During my 2-week suspension, I did not envision myself purchasing a firearm, tracking down the people involved and shooting them. No. I envisioned myself rounding up everyone there, keeping them locked up in a basement somewhere, heading down to a pharmacy to procure some laxatives, collecting their collective diarrhea between the bunch of them in a bucket, and using it to drown them, because I have heard that drowning is an incredibly unpleasant way to die. That the feeling of losing your oxygen and losing the ability to breathe is by itself unpleasant, and how much more unpleasant it would be to be smelling and breathing and feeling that diarrhea fill your lungs. That is what I wanted to do to the people who had wronged me. For a post-October 7th example, this was a Facebook discussion I had with someone who currently serves on another group I used to be involved with, the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network. This person linked to an editorial shortly after Zoran Mamdani secured the Democratic nomination for New York City mayor about how maybe we shouldn't be focused too much on the exact words of Globalize the Intifada. And my response, I think the article misses the point, and I listed off 4 lines that I wish Zoran Mamdani would draw. I said, the key word should be, you can't say that. You can't say that Israel was founded illegitimately. And I talked about identifying based on the original borders of the partition plan and where Jews lived and where Arabs lived and where nobody really lived, like much of the Negev desert. And that, no, you can't try to say, oh, well, the landmass was not proportionally distributed. Yeah, the empty landmass is not the issue. And you can't try to say that any Arabs living in the proposed state of Israel were going to be forced out as part of the proposal. You also can't say that Arab animosity was either due to the Nakba or due to aspects of the occupation. The Nakba was a result of the Arab-led war. Right? You look at the chronology, that is undeniable. And you look at the chronology of when Israel has had stricter rules for the occupation, when Israel has had more relaxed rules, and which of those led to more versus less Palestinian terrorism. The causation is pretty clear. Israel's stringencies in the occupation were a response to Arab violence and not the other way around. You can't say that Israel's war in Gaza is fueled by an attempt to kill as many Gazans as possible. You look at the measures Israel is taking to try to prevent civilian deaths, and you compare to what actual genocidal intent would lead to, and it just doesn't match up. And you can't say that Israel should be judged more harshly because of being Western or privileged or wealthy or European. Racism is still racist. So I have these clearly thought out arguments, and there's a response. This woman responded, all 4 of those statements are up for debate. No, they are not. I'm giving actual reasons, and if she's going to debate, poke some holes in what I'm saying. The conversation went on. I'm not uploading the whole thing here, but she started talking about how, oh, well, 75 years of history, blah, blah. Okay, mention something that happened in the 75 years. And ultimately saying, it's clear we don't agree. Sorry, you can't just choose to disagree with the facts I'm presenting. For people who try to say that slander and political lies can just be fought naturally by speaking the truth, you've seen some of my work attempting to assess the effects of confirmation bias, and you see stuff like that here. No, sometimes people will just choose not to acknowledge the fact, and it's not okay to tell me to just let that happen. And while murdering this woman would not be just, doing absolutely nothing would not be justice either. What I posted was, no, you can't dismiss mathematical theorem as up for debate. Then you see the dripping red blood font.
I find myself running out of non-violent options.
But I don't have any violent options either. Now that was what I actually posted. In my mind, I imagined myself being in the same room as her in the context that I had been before, at a particular autistic rights conference, where, among other things, food was served because it was several days long. I fantasized about each of grabbing one of the chairs and crushing her skull, or grabbing some of the cutlery and slitting her throat. I'll assure you I will not let those fantasies make their way into reality. Now, some examples that I did walk back by modifying after posting. After the 2-month ceasefire, on the day that I read that during the 2-month ceasefire, Hamas had gathered or produced enough weaponry to launch a rocket attack at a southern coastal city, and the fear that they may do more and more. It turns out they didn't all that much, but I kind of snapped, and here I said, if you try to pass off saying that Israel has just stolen Palestinian land as legitimate criticism of Israel, if you try to blame the violence on the Nakba, concealing the fact that the Nakba was a response to the Arab-led war against fair partition, especially the siege of Jerusalem, if you dismiss the ubiquitous anti-Semitic animosity towards Israel because racism only counts when it's part of a system of oppression, or if you say or imply that Hamas firing rockets at Israeli civilians with no intended military target is less problematic than Israel bombing terrorist locations and killing civilians in the wrong place at the wrong time. You are not innocent! Yes, all anti-Zionists! Now, you notice a gap here on each of these. What previously went in that gap before I modified it was, you are not innocent, and I want you dead. Yes, all anti-Zionists. I did walk that back. The versions currently on my Facebook have the gap instead of the call for mass murder. But this is just to let you know the dark places my mind has gone. And if you know other people who have had deeper homicidal ideation and they're telling you something other than what I'm about to, listen to them when it comes to how to talk them down. But otherwise, if with this in mind, I am the most bloodthirsty, murderous person you know, then when I say, if I snap and actually the ideation becomes intent, this is what it would take to talk me down, I think you should listen to me. Now, to ease your concerns somewhat, no, I'm not actually about to become a serial. I've discussed the difference between homicidal ideation and homicidal intent, and I do have a safeguard to prevent it from reaching that intent. As some of you may know, I've been in a happy, loving relationship the past 2 years and change. And so currently, in my unsnapped, not homicidal intent state, I decided to try to set some boundaries to prevent myself from ever reaching that state. And what I've come up with is this. Suppose I become convinced that murder is justified in some case, and that I'm in a position to actually go out and kill somebody. If I'm that convinced of it, I could use the help and should have no issue talking to my level-headed, logical partner, saying, I could use the extra hands. These arms can't pack much of a punch. Now, realistically, that is not a conversation that would ever go well. I'm not relying on her actually stopping me. I'm relying on the realization that if I have any doubt as to how that conversation would go, so I have doubts, so I shouldn't do anything so final and irreversible as go out and murder anybody, or even give anybody a permanent physical or mental disability, which I've also sometimes thought of as a reasonable punishment. People can't advocate for terrorism if they can't advocate for much of anything because they have trouble stringing 3 sentences together. Also, in addition to that safeguard, I've realized the following. If the issue deals with a speech crime and that somebody's speech is having material implications and material detriment to me or the people I care about, well, we have rules about when your speech has material implication and material detriment to other people. You don't kill people for slander. You sue them. And so even if I were to go out and commit a crime, I see myself trying to orchestrate a theft or a heist long before I would actually try to orchestrate murder. And I'd still try to bring my partner in if I were convinced that it were time for a heist. But even that I consider highly unlikely. Realistically, I'm not going on a heist, and I'm certainly not going on a murder spree. I felt like it was important to give you convincing reason to believe that I won't start killing people after showing you just how dark some of my thoughts have gotten. Now, of course, all this is one particular motivation for political violence. Jew living in Israel, worried about Israel-related anti-Semitism. in general, the general recipe for political violence, I would say, is this. So the perpetrator, it has some sort of moral code, nothing wrong with that. The potential victim has some other moral code and is violating the potential perpetrator's moral code. And that other means wouldn't lead the potential victim back within the bounds of the potential perpetrator's moral code. What other means am I thinking of? Debate, discussion, or appealing to some authority to seek out punishment. If this is happening on a college campus, right? If a professor is teaching lies about Israel, if you have reason to believe that the administration would stop that professor from teaching those lies, right? Either put an observer in, have someone co-teach the class who can correct any false or misleading information, or just fire the professor. If that's going to happen, then there's no need to go out and kill anybody. If not, then you start thinking, well, what am I supposed to do? So the main ingredients of that recipe are contradictory moral codes and lack of civil options. And an important note here, if contradictory moral codes try to coexist, political violence becomes nearly inevitable. If in a discussion somebody can say, well, your version of justice is nonsense, and the other person can say, well, your version of justice is nonsense, and there's no way of explaining, no, one of you is actually wrong, then what are they supposed to do? It's unreasonable to ask someone to do absolutely nothing in the face of a grave violation of a moral code. This is why it's necessary to find some sort of absolute moral code. And in my video refuting political extremism nearly 2 years ago, I went into the math on that. As a review, you presume it's called monotonicity. Essentially, catastrophes are bad. If something would make life worse for everyone else, for everyone, right, that's a bad thing. You presume symmetry, that explicit racism is bad, or that you can't say, oh, well, I'm fine with white people holding this advantage over black people, but not the other way around. Now, that particular one can maybe, like, if there is a weakness to this argument, it's going to be that one, which sounds awful, but it's more that the other stuff is just that rock solid, and that I'll get to how to talk down far-right white supremacist extremists. But you presume continuity, that whatever social welfare function you're using is a continuous function of the individual welfares. You presume indifference to any truly unaffected citizens. Don't worry too much about those most recent 2 points, right? The continuity and the indifference towards unaffected citizens. That doesn't really show up much in what I'm going to talk about. You presume fairness to somehow be preferable. Right? That means unless you had reason to believe that you would be unfairly benefiting, you would prefer a fair society. And we presume adopting some sort of expected satisfaction-based theory of risk assessment. And as a review, a couple of results from these assumptions. You can no longer say that anything that makes things more equal should be strived for, and that's justice and perfection, because that can violate monotonicity. Right? Nuclear winter would be perfectly just and fair to everybody, but not what we want to see. You can't say in a conflict of interest where at least one person is gaining and another person is losing, you try to go for whatever going to make things more equal, right? Well, that would rule out the nuclear winter issue. You do have to acknowledge that the gain for whoever's gaining could be small enough to offset the loss for whoever's losing stuff. And I go into more detail in the longer version of that. But according to those principles, there are two distinct, absolutely immoral codes. On the right, there's white supremacism, which ignores symmetry. And on the left, there's regressive leftism, which ignores monotonicity. And so what happens when moral codes collide? Well, in the worst case, you get political violence. So what happens leading up to that to try to prevent it? This is where debate and discussion is most important. When you come to debate, you have to be prepared to argue your case in front of an imaginary judge that does not already agree with your moral code. You have to start with enough basic assumptions that you feel like almost nobody would object to. And you also do have to be open to the possibility that if you don't have like a thorough, iron-tight theorem, maybe the other person's moral code is correct. You have to at least, if you're going to say it's wrong, you have to point out what in there you think is wrong. Now, I see four main possibilities for the source of political violence. The potential perpetrator could either be far left or far right, and the potential victim could either be far left or far right. And so if you're going to try to talk people down or convince people in that situation not to actually engage in the violence they're thinking of, well, you want to identify, do I think that the potential perpetrator is just in the wrong and that this potential victim isn't actually doing anything wrong? Or do I think that the potential victim is doing something wrong and need to seek out some sort of non-violent justice? So when you've identified that the potential victim is staying within bounds and doesn't need to be punished at all, that's when you confront whichever person you're worried about and start asking, well, how do you know your moral code is right? And you want to think about it, try to figure out ahead of time what you think that person's moral code is and what the objection is, and try to find some sort of contradiction between that person's moral code and the basic rules that I've outlined. And as long as you can plant just some uncertainty in the potential perpetrator's mind, that's enough to prevent anyone from doing something with such finality. Now, this is easier done on paper for far leftists than far rightists, because you look back at those rules, there's nothing in particular that a far leftist would have to find objectionable. Whereas for far rightists, there is that idea of, well, symmetry shouldn't be much of a thing, and instead, each country, each group should try to defend itself and prioritize those most similar to you. And that's when you go into possibly, but the best way for self-defense is not to get into any fights in the first place, and point out that since the end of World War II, no two countries with human development indices above 850 have gone to war with each other, and that it's always peace and prosperity, not war and prosperity. And if you're going to try to oppress people because you outnumber them, well, it's only a matter of time before that comes back to bite you. That's my best advice for trying to talk down a far-right white supremacist who may believe that the shifting demographics in the United States pose an existential threat or something like that. So as difficult as it is to tell someone close to you, I think your ideology is off the rails, that actually feels like the simpler or easier conversation. The harder one is when the potential target really is in the wrong, and you have to try to convince your friend, the potential perpetrator, not to commit a violent crime. And so what do you do and what don't you do? You don't try to ignore the problem. You don't say, I get it that you're angry, but let's not talk about what you're angry about. You don't try to convince the potential perpetrator that the problem itself isn't the problem, and that it's just your attitude towards it that's the problem. You don't try to talk about the serenity prayer and, well, let's accept the things that I can't change, and the power to change things that I can, and the wisdom to tell the difference. If that person is planning a violent crime, then they think they can change things, and you're not going to like how. Other stuff not to do. Absolutely do not try to take a pluralistic approach and say something about multiple truths or you have the right to your own narrative. No, absolute right and wrong do sometimes exist. And if you don't have a good argument why the potential victim is in the right, because this potential victim isn't in the right and just deserves not a lethal punishment, don't try to say, oh, well, we all have the right to our opinions. We have the right to our opinions. We don't have the right to our own facts. Don't accuse the perpetrator of being the problem or overreacting. Do not try a thoughts and prayers approach of just assuming that eventually this person will be punished by some other authority or something. Assume for the moment the potential perpetrator tried that, or maybe ask, have you tried that, and expect the answer to be yes. But if the answer is no, okay, so then we can work on that. But one other warning, if you confront someone and it's clear to that person that you're not actually interested in fixing the problem, you're interested in stopping them from fixing the problem, through violence, you might become the next target. Because from that person's perspective, well, I know what justice is. From that person's perspective, that person's thinking, I know what justice is. I know I've got this path towards justice, and you're trying to get in my way. You could be putting yourself in danger. So you should try to prevent the version of perceived justice involving violent crime, but it shouldn't be by ignoring the problem completely. It should be by actively finding some legitimate alternative. That means start with an attempt at debate. Start with, can we try talking to this person first? Okay, presumably that's already happened, but you try that. Have some sort of contingency for if the target is not interested in the facts and is just going to ignore real debate. And also, your legitimate alternative needs something similar. I don't know if you've heard about SMART goals, but something similar to that. You want a specific, measurable plan. You want to say, okay, let's not kill this person, but come up with something else that can be easily determined. Did our punishment actually happen or not? You have to be looking at something implementable. If that means appealing to some sort of authority system, great. There should be a contingency for if that authority system is not interested in justice. And so whatever non-lethal alternative you have in mind should be implementable at the vigilante level. And if you aren't ready to propose that, you aren't ready to talk this person down. Also, do make sure whatever you propose, you'll have at least some reason to believe it will address the problem. That doesn't necessarily mean get rid of the problem 100% completely, but just making some progress should hopefully be good enough to prevent the potential perpetrator from doing anything that could get his or herself arrested. Overall, if you see someone saying the kinds of violent things that I've been saying and setting off red flags in your head, identify whether the perpetrator or the target is the one whose beliefs have crossed the line. If you're going to try to tell the perpetrator your target isn't actually doing anything wrong, show that you legitimately care by setting clear lines and explaining why the lines are where they are. And if you agree that the potential victim is in the wrong, but obviously does not deserve capital punishment without a trial, try to convince the perpetrator to pursue a different approach, and do offer a legitimately viable solution. I know it's weird to hear a mathematician talk about thinking of being a serial killer and what it would take to stop me. And if you have other friends who seem more like the serial killer type than I do, and they're saying something else, it would take something else to stop them, okay, those other friends are probably right. But if my perspective is the closest to an insider's perspective on political violence that you can get, please take this into consideration. Until next time, this is Dr. Nighttime wishing you a good night.